Benjamin in his Arcades work. Benjamin writes, I have to quote, suicide appears as the quintessence of modernity. And this was somehow one of the starting points for my book. And indeed, after the attempt to take one's own life was for centuries regarded as a sin, grave sin, or as an expression of mental illness, and in some countries even sanctioned by criminal law, for example, in the United Kingdom until 1961, and in Israel, I think, until 1966. We now can see a profound change in mentality, and it gradually took place in the second half of the 20th century, which has contributed to the emergence of a new culture of death and dying. More and more often, one's own death is seen as a project that has to be shaped and accounted for by the individual himself. Those who take their own life no longer want to don't want to just accept it, give it new meanings and such things. And this is, I think, a very interesting point. I was inspired even by a Flemish philosopher, Patricia de Matelare, which unfortunately was never translated to English or German. And but I have the luck, my wife is half Dutch, half German, and helped me to translate the most important essays in her book, which has, my Dutch is very bad, in Verlangen nach Untrostbarkeit, I think it was. Okay. There is an essay in it. You can say it better, of course. There is an essay in it about Lebenskunst, art of living.
Yes.
And there she develops. It's an essay on suicide, and it's a very interesting position, as she claims it's necessary to see suicide as a possibility to, besides many others, and to have your life as a work of art. And if you have it as a work of art, you have to finish it. And therefore, she explains, so many artists have finished their lives after having finished an important novel or an artwork or something like this. And this is where I think between Benjamin's quote and Patricia de Matelare, I started to write this book.
Okay, so you said that it's about the way that we look at death and at suicide, that has changed in modern age.
Yes.
But very practically speaking, if you say that it is a leitmotif in modern age, suicide, does it also mean, for example, that there has been an increase in the number of suicides over time?
We don't know so very exactly, because we have not really exact numbers, even for the Middle Ages or for the early modernity, and therefore we don't know exactly if suicide really increased. It increased, of course, as a topic in a lot of cultural productions, in pictures, in images, in novels, in theater performances, in operas, and so on. And it is a topic which is very present in literary work and such things. And therefore, I think it's not allowed to say we have a real increasing of suicides. And of course, we have a lot of, I don't know how to say in English. In German, we say Dunkelziffer. You know, we have a number of uncounted, unreported cases, and therefore, yeah, it's a problem with statistics of suicide.
So under-reporting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and this is one of the problems I wanted to deal with in my book. Suicide is, at least today, something like a taboo. And I made an experience after having published a book. I met several friends during the forthcoming months, and we had lunch or dinner, and they knew I had written this book and read some chapters, and then they told me stories about suicides in her family, father, mother, brother, sister. And it was very touching for me because I knew these friends very long time. I said to them, I know you since about 15 years, 20 years, and you never told me this story. And then they said always the same sentence, nobody was speaking with us. Darüber wird bei uns nicht gesprochen. Thereabout we don't speak. And I thought it's very important to have a situation in there we can talk about. And I'm very happy that a famous museum in Kassel in Germany plans to open an exhibition in fall 2021 on this topic. And they had a wonderful title. It's called Suicide, Let's Talk About It. And I thought that's the secret subtitle of my book, Let's Talk About It, and not being mute and without any chance to have conversation.
Okay. Now you already referred to, for example, in Christianity, that suicide is seen as a sin, that in some countries even not until quite recently, well, let's say 50, 60 years ago, it was actually forbidden in criminal law to take your own life. But there seem to be, you also address in your book, that there are maybe two extremes in looking at suicide. So either being fascinated by it and that it is seen as like an ultimate act of self-determination and can be seen as heroic. And the other extreme is maybe the taboo you were also just talking about, and where it is seen as an ultimate expression of weakness, of cowardice even. What kind of factors determine how societies look at suicide?
Of course, there are a lot of factors determining how societies look at suicide. Of course, religions play, even today, an important role. Traditions, rituals, gender roles and narratives. It's very interesting that the few notifications of suicide we find in history rather early start to count suicides of men and women and to compare. And it's till today you have at least a national statistic of suicide and even of male and female suicide. I'm very interested in the four types of suicide. Emil Durkheim distinguished in his famous book on suicide from 1897. It's somehow the twin of Sigmund Freud's Traumdeutung, I think, 3 years later. Durkheim says there are selfish suicides, which is not a real good term, of course, which refer to one's own illness and pain and something like an unbearable life. Then second type is, for him, is altruistic suicide, where somebody sacrifices himself for a cause or another person. In other words, it's something like martyrdom in a different way. Then he has the fatalistic suicide, which responds to events that cannot be handled or even foreseen. Maybe a pandemic is something like a fatalistic situation as we have nowadays. And finally, and this is most interesting for me, he calls a type of suicide he calls anomic suicide. Anomic suicide in which the order of a community or an entire society is broken, crashed somehow. I myself consider this anomic suicide. Famous examples are the mass suicides after the end of World War II in Germany and Japan. I found it really, I think Berlin had in April 1945 had a suicide quote of 250 persons on 100,000 inhabitants, very, very high. And in Japan, similar situation. I think this is a very relevant factor even for contemporary times. You have the anomic suicide is the suicide when all your traditions, when the thing you have as an order of society has crashed for your own conscience.
Okay, so referring to Durkheim, you explained 4 different kinds of suicides and how we can see that also nowadays. But does that also mean that societies can make, or people in societies may distinguish different kinds? So maybe some kinds may be seen in a negative light, whereas other motives for suicide may be seen in a positive light?
Yes, of course. We have changing mentalities even in debates on the so-called, by Durkheim, so-called selfish suicide. Of course, all our debates and discussions on hospice, on palliative medicine, and so on, are determined by this evidence that the selfish suicide in an unbearable situation of life has not to be criminalized, has not to be pathologized, but is a situation in which a man can say, now it's the point I want to finish the life. And I'm therefore happy that the Karlsruhe in Germany now had very late, in comparison with the Netherlands or Switzerland, very late found the decision to allow something like dignitas or exit or such possibilities to get support for the plan to end your life.
Talking about this different ways of looking at suicide and different motives for suicide, is there a difference between countries in suicide rates, and can this be explained by cultural differences between those countries?
It's rather complicated because we have, of course, comparison between different countries. And the World Health Organization, WHO, of course, is collecting national statistics. We shouldn't forget there are all national statistics collected and concluded in a global statistic. And if we see these statistics and the quotes, and it's always like in the pandemics in Germany now, it's always a number for 100,000 people. And if we see, I looked, I think the material I was looking about was from 2016. Lithuania was has a very strong suicide rate, which is number 1 in the world, 31.9, and Russia 31, Guyana 29.2, and South Korea 26.9. These are the leading countries. But of course, we have to be very careful in using such statistics, because there are a lot of countries making, for political or ideological reasons, the numbers more adequate and better than they are. even there is a strong Dunkelziffer. And of course, there are a lot of countries where WHO only can estimate the real quote of suicide. And the most highest suicide rate in the world is always reported for, you won't think about, for Greenland. Greenland had between 1990 and 1994 a suicide rate of 107 suicides per 100,000 inhabitants. And but we have to know this is an extrapolation, because Greenland has about 50,000, 55,000 inhabitants, and therefore to be able to compare, you have to extrapolate how many suicides they would have if they would have 100,000 inhabitants. But of course, I read during writing the book by Anna Kim on Anatomy of a Night, and this is a story about something like a suicide epidemic in Greenland. And of course, and this is serious, we have, I think, every fourth or fifth inhabitant of Greenland has tried once in his life to commit suicide. And of course, it's not easy now to say which cultural traditions. I think even for Lithuania or Russia, it's or Guyana, it's evident that this problem of the anomic suicide I mentioned in quoting Emil Durkheim are very, very important factors, more than religion.
Okay, okay. Now, I would like to go to a different aspect. You mentioned Patricia de Martelare, who describes life as a project and a work of art, including death. More broadly speaking, how would you describe the relationship between suicide and art?
And that's a very interesting and complicated question. As artists have in general, it's not a very good statistics only for the US. Stephen Stack worked about it. It's double bill fourth than the rest of the population. They have, so to say, a higher suicide risk. But it's, and even authors and painters and less musicians and dancers. I think it's more complicated to write books or to paint pictures than to dance or being an actor or something like this. But it's even a double risk in comparison with the rest of the population. And I was very impressed by Martelare's hypothesis that it's in a strong relation to the ambition to finish a work. When Sylvia Plath finished her novel on the gas spell, I think some weeks or months later, she committed suicide in a very tragic way. And it has a connection between having finished the work and finishing life, as if life would be a work of art too. And even in philosophy, one of the most famous philosophers on suicide is Philip Meinlander, and he wrote a book in German, a strong, voluminous book on Philosophie der Erlösung, and he killed himself when the first copies arrived. Or think about Carlo Michelstädter, which is a famous Italian philosopher who died very, very young, at the age of 23, after having completed his thesis. And and there are a lot of similar cases, and that's an interesting point. And Martelare says it's a way of going with this art of life, even to the end of life.
So, is that also a way of saying that there is a kind of aesthetics to suicide?
Yes, yes. That's the subtitle of Madelare's essay on the aesthetics of suicide. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what are significant cultural developments around suicide? For example, you also write about the role of the farewell letter and how this has developed. Can you comment on that?
Yes, that's very interesting because this is a very new genre of texts. You can have in the second half of the 18th century starting, and it's in connection with the process of alphabetization. People had to go to school and could read and started to write, and even if they decided to end their life, they wrote farewell letters. And in the early newspapers this time very often printed such farewell letters. It was something like a popular genre. And there is a wonderful story I read in a book on the cultural history of suicide about a Parisian situation when a shoemaker there had a catastrophic. He was a fan of his club. He always met, I think, once a week, his friends, and they discussed about literature. And it was an ambitious shoemaker. And one evening he came home, and his wife had left him, and his daughter was in jail because of prostitution, and his son was going to the army, and his wife had left him, even taking all his money with her. And then he decided, okay, I will commit suicide. And so was it reported. And what is his project now? I have to write a farewell letter. And I have to end this farewell letter with a good quote. And he knows a good quote, but isn't quite sure who wrote it really. Was it Rousseau, or is it another guy? And therefore he decides, I will meet my friends and ask them. And they have no Google, of course, and therefore it's a long discussion, and they have to discuss it during the next meeting next week. And there is a group discussing the farewell letter one of her members wants to write. And of course it has a happy end, because after 3 weeks the shoemaker decides life is rather funny, and I'll earn enough money next year, and my wife has left me, it's okay, and he's quite okay with his life, and he had this project not of suicide but of writing a farewell letter, and it keeps him in life. And on the other side you have very fascinating ways of writing a farewell letter, even in the during the 19th century. There are now published a lot of collections of such farewell letters. It's very interesting. It's a rather new genre in producing literature, but for people who just were somehow alphabetized and had learned to read and to write and to give something like a note even to the end of their lives.
Yeah, the first story is quite interesting. So actually the project of writing the farewell letter resulted in not saying farewell, not committing suicide.
No. That's the point of another quote I very much like in Walker Percy's novel, The Moviegoer. There is a suicidal protagonist called Kate, and there is one significant passage, and there she says, I don't know why you are thinking always I'm suicidal. Considering suicide is for me the possibility not to commit suicide. And I would kill me if I wouldn't have the possibility to kill me. And I don't need mysteries, I don't need chocolate, I don't even need Nembutal, she says. But without suicide, without considering suicide, I couldn't stay in life. And this is an interesting point, to have this chance to consider this possibility is maybe not the significance of a pathology, but even of a chance to move forward and to write maybe a farewell letter, but not to take your farewell.
So in a sense, it may be comforting to consider, to have the possibility.
Yes. Yes.
That brings me to another point. You already mentioned Sigmund Freud in passing when you mentioned Émile Durkheim. And Freud had this idea that there is like a death drive in humans. He refers to the thanatos. What do you think of that? And is our fascination with suicide, is that linked to this idea?
I'm not sure, because Freud himself wasn't quite sure about his death drive, and the question is, they're struggling between Eros and Thanatos, or is it another issue, another thing? His friend Melanie Klein then had the idea that first is death drive and second comes Eros. And the question we should ask Freud, if he would be there, is which interest drives death drive? Is this death, or is death something inimaginable? Like Freud writes in an essay from 1915, death is not perceivable. It's not. There is no imagination nor mental representation of death, and therefore, maybe death drive is in search of quietness, in search of being in a specific way supported, and maybe death drive is not this cruel topic we might imagine if we discuss about Anthropocene and climate change and suicide of mankind itself. It's more searching for a quiet situation where I be secure and not disturbed by any obligations. A wonderful idea, and therefore I think it's not so clear in Freud's construction, even till the late essay on das Unbehagen in der Kultur, if death drive really wants death, or drives to death, or maybe to something like a phase before being born, or oceanic feeling, as he calls it in das Unbehagen in der Kultur. I hope so very much. Death drive is not really, as in the famous book of Karl Menninger was calling it, self-destructive.
Okay. Thank you so far, Mr. Macho, and please stay with us, because we will get back to you. But for this moment now, I would like to invite the other guests to the stage here, and so we can continue the conversation together with them. Derek de Beurs and Saskia Mérelle, I would like to invite you to join us on stage. And I already briefly introduced them at the start, but I will do this again now to make very clear. Saskia Mérelle, you're a senior researcher at 113 Suicide Prevention, and you are specialized in suicide prevention among youngsters. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And Derek de Beurs, you're the head of the program on epidemiology at the Trimbos Institute here in the Netherlands. Also a senior researcher at the Department of Clinical Psychology at the Free University in Amsterdam. And author of another book. I will also show this.
It's a bit smaller.
It's a bit smaller.
It's a bit smaller.
Which is called Mythen over zelfmoord, or in English, Myths on Suicide. Welcome as well.
Thank you.
Derek, there are 9 myths, if I remember correctly, that you write about in this book. One of them is about the season when suicides peak. So I would say now we are approaching the season of the cold and dark days. So are we to expect more suicides now?
Well, that's one of the most fascinating and counterintuitive myths I try to tackle in this book, is that we actually find, when you look at the statistics, is that people do not more often die in Christmas times for suicide, but they more often die in springtime.
Really?
So that's something which you not expect, and something which we see over all the countries for over years, except for this year. So apparently something happened with the COVID and the lockdown measurements, which sort of caused that this peak was not here now. And one of the explanations for this counterintuitive spring peak is that people, it's called the broken promise effect. So people have the idea that I will carry on for the new life. In January, a new year starts, but then the year has disappointed them in spring. And other people, they get more excited and more happy. So they go out and they have fun. And the contrasts then become too painful between your failed life and you don't want to live another lonely year. And that's one of the explanations that the peak appears in all the countries over all the world, in every hemisphere in the spring.
Okay, because other people around people who may have been depressed, for example, suicidal, did not go out and have a good time.
And now the idea
everyone had to stay at home.
That's with the COVID thing. One of the, so
okay, that's interesting.
So we're all in the same depressing boat together, and that sort of is comforting for some people.
Okay, and actually in the last chapter of your book, you write, well, there will be another economic recession, and we should already think about it because this can also impact suicide rates.
Yeah.
Can you explain that? Is it likely now to happen with the impact of COVID-19 and economic recession? And if so, can we do something about that?
Yeah, that's a very relevant question now. And the honest answer is that we just don't know, because COVID is a really unique, novel situation. So the myth in my book is about the impact of the economic recession. And there we've seen in Western countries a steep rise in suicide numbers, especially for middle-aged men. And that was also in in the crisis in Asia, they found the same patterns. So that's quite a consistent pattern, that when an economic crisis hits, that has an impact on the suicide numbers. But with COVID, it's really different. So actually, we actually see a reduction so we don't see an increase that we expected in the spring. And the suicide ideation, so the suicidal thoughts, they don't rise as much as we would have expected. So this is just a novel situation. But we can say, because the economic recession is still needs to hit us, because the government in the Netherlands, at least, is doing a lot of things to support people getting fired. So it is realistic to prepare for the worst. And when the economic recession full-blown hits us, then we can expect another rise in suicides.
Okay, thank you. Saskia, there's also a lot of attention in public debate on how the COVID-19 measures especially affect young people. Is this something that you see in your work?
Yeah, we have a helpline. People can contact us 24/7. And what we saw is, especially among young people, the social isolation, which also increases suicidal thoughts, but also the lack of structure. And also for some children that they have to stay at home, where there's a lot of tension between parents. And so I think the major challenge in this period will be that the schools remain open. So the children are able to leave their house to meet their friends. It's very important for the social, emotional development, for their identity. And what we also saw on the helpline is that mental health care, that they had difficulty to reach their care provider. So I think another major challenge will be that, psychiatrists or psychologists can reach out to children, so that they get enough protection to visit children.
So you said social isolation is a factor of importance. Structure or lack of structure.
Yeah, it's very important.
And there may be a difficult situation at home, and then school and other places are important to be able to get away from that.
Yeah.
And the ability to reach help.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It's very important.
Yes. Okay. Of course, now we are the four of us here on stage, or at least on screen, Mr. Macho. So we will now broaden the discussion with the four of us. Maybe you want to ask a question to Mr. Macho. There's an opportunity to do that as well. Derek?
Yes, if I may, Mr. Macho, thank you very much for your very interesting book, which I will definitely need to read a few more times to get every aspect of it, because there's so many details in the book. And I think it's also a great work of reference to get inspiration from, and other books to read and films to watch. So that's very inspiring. And the thing I was wondering, because I'm more in the field of really suicide prevention, is what role would you think that this more philosophical discussion should have within suicide prevention? Should it have a role? Because now actually it doesn't have really a role. And if so, what role can it have? How can it help prevention?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting and important question, and I would mention before, I would very much like to read your book, and I'll buy it because my wife can translate it for me a little bit, and therefore I have a chance. It's not translated in English for now, but it's a wonderful topic. These myths of suicide.
Yeah, I'll send you a copy. Yeah.
And now back to your question. I think and the point which could be from interest for suicide prevention is to have a lot of traces and ways to talk about suicide. I think that's one thing I even said to our moderator. I think most important is not to have this situation of I can't speak about it. It's something like a taboo I have to be ashamed of. And it's very useful to have a lot of references, even in the question of humor, like with suicide prevention with young people. There are a lot of references, and it's important to know and to see and to discuss it. One simple example, there is a rather famous young singer, pop singer, Billie Eilish, and she's I think she's now 19, but when she started, she was around 17, and she had a lot of suicide songs, and there is one song I remember, Bury a Friend. And this friend is somehow even herself, you might guess. And there is the refrain with them, I wanna end me. I wanna end me. And then it's a specific flatline sound, which is one of the acoustic representations of that. And I found very interesting to see some concerts of her, YouTube or other social media platforms, when the kids are even singing this refrain, this "I wanna end me" together, and I would like to know what are they feeling? What's the point of this identification? And I have somehow the impression that our discussions on Werther effects and such things, being scared by suicide epidemics or so, is not always, maybe sometimes, but is not always helpful, because it doesn't allow to have this conversation, this talking about it in a situation it might be necessary and very important. And I was very happy when I read some weeks ago some newer studies by a guy named, I think, David Ferguson or something, who had collected a lot of studies and discussed them on the question of imitation, suicide imitation, which is a topic even for prevention of suicide of young people. And his point is very easy. He says, of course, there is a higher imitation risk if you have a prominent role model, somebody like a football player or a famous singer or something. There is a high risk, and maybe there is just a much higher risk even with own parents. If you're, I didn't find statistics, but I'm quite sure they exist about higher suicide risk if one of your parents, mother or father or sister or brother, has committed suicide. And the other side is all this fictional stuff, novels, movies, TV series like 13 Reasons Why or something like this are not that important. We don't have really evidence that there are imitation suicides. And this is, I think, very interesting for me, because I always thought even young people can distinguish between reality and fiction, and it's good they can. So,
No, go ahead.
No, I'm very interested to hear.
Okay, now maybe just for the people watching or here who haven't read the book yet, you mentioned the Werther effect or Werther effect, and you explained that it's about imitation behavior, but can you explain where the term comes from? So what we mean by it?
From Goethe's Werther, which was a novel, or first novel in letters Goethe wrote, and it was forbidden sometime. And it's rather crazy, because if you read the Werther novel by Goethe, you see the romanticization of suicide. It's inspired by a real suicide by Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem. It's rather cruel, the end, and Werther fails during his life, not only in love, but in his work, and it's a sad end, but without any romantic appeal. And you have a lot of psychiatrists and physicians in the beginning of the 19th century, starting with this imitation suicide. And even they are proposing it would be better if people couldn't read, against self-criticization, against school, if they wouldn't read and wouldn't go to theater and see Romeo and Julia or something. I found one quote when an author even says, to have Shakespeare not on stage or something like this, because we have a lot of imitational suicides. And that's interesting, because there is no statistical or real evidence for it. And
I see that Derek is
I think you're right about Hamlet and Romeo and Julia, but we do see after Robert Enke, who was a German football player, died, and the media was really sensational about that, and also with the methods was via the train, which is highly accessible, that we saw an enormous peak in the suicide rates afterwards. Yes. So it's more in these extreme cases. So I don't think in art the Werther effect applies the same. It's more that such highly influential public figures die by suicide.
Saskia, what is your view on this? Also, Derek now mentioned that it's also about how the media report on it when someone is as visible as influential commits suicide. In your research on youngsters, what do you see?
Yeah, we also found evidence for contagious effects, but not by Netflix series such as 13 Reasons Why. But we saw that some adolescents, they developed a suicidal identity because of they only followed depressive persons on Instagram, or they shared images of self-harm or depressive poems through WhatsApp. And the most dangerous aspect of it is that you create a competitive behavior. So who is the most sick? Who has the deepest wounds? And so that's also my question for what can we do about it? We are very worried about all the algorithms of social media. So how can we teach children to stay healthy, not to participate in sick social networks? Because that we found in children who were admitted to hospital, that they only stayed in contact with fellow patients, and so then we saw the contagious effect and the risk of it.
Yes, I totally agree with this position. Of course, social media are some way of maybe something like an in-between of reality and fictional stuff. But I think this is much more dangerous. And I had one student during my time in Berlin wrote a very good master thesis on the blue whale challenge, and she did it really. She tried to do it, and like an ethnologist, and it was very helpful to have strong conversations with her about this experiment.
Sorry, can you explain what challenge that is exactly?
Blue whale challenge is something like I'm not even sure if it's already darknet or even one part of internet, whereas you have to do a lot of examinations. It even starts with scratching your arm and ends with suicide. And its title is inspired by some blue whales, where there was a discussion about if whales are committing suicide if they go on swim on the land and dying there. And there was a discussion too if the blue whale challenge is even a fake, total fake, a media fake, and something, and therefore my student decided to try, and it was rather scary and very interesting, because she had really good script and idea to how to. I think she met. There are, I think, 50 or 60 examination situations, things you must do, and she stopped maybe with 25 or 30 or something like this. And this is a way, it's very important. We shouldn't have the idea of imitation as a new form of taboo to talk about this. It's important to see these connections, and it's maybe the best way to have an experiment like this, and producing a good master thesis too, and I learned a lot about this phenomenon.
But were there recommendations in this master's thesis on the question that Saskia Mérelle posed? How can we teach youngsters to stay healthy in this sense?
You must. I think the message by this young student could have been to say it's even too very important to have a conversation and talk with us about this. It's if we are not healthy, maybe on different situations, contexts, causes, and so on. It's not always helpful to have somebody who wants to teach me to be healthy, because I'm in a situation in it where I can't be healthy myself. And it might be helpful to go with these fantasies and to share them, and to have a situation which is better than my own. When I meet friends after 20 years, they are telling me that they lost their parents through suicide. And I think this simple "let's talk about it" is for me something like a motto and a real idea for how to deal with it. And
Okay.
it's complicated if the thing is tabooed.
Yep.
Yeah.
Tabooized.
Maybe Derek, a question to you, because we discussed the Werther effect or the Werther effect, but you also describe another effect, which may be the opposite, the Papageno.
The Papageno effect. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
Can you explain that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's from an Austrian
Yes.
citizen, colleague, land citizen, Thomas Niederkortenthaler.
Yeah.
And he thought, well, if the media can have a negative effect, couldn't the opposite be true? If you do positive stories in the media of people who recovered from suicidal thoughts, wouldn't that be helpful? And he named that Papageno after the Mozart figure from Die Zauberflöte, who developed suicidal thoughts during the opera, but then his friends help him with that, and then he recovers from them. So that's, but it's a new line of research. So there are some indications that indeed it helps to hear about stories of people who recovered from suicidal thoughts. But we're still researching that, so we don't know how to best do it. Yeah.
Okay. In general, because Mr. Macho also stresses the importance of not having the taboo, and let's talk about it. But there seems to be, the way I look at it, a tension between talking about it and also, Derek, for example, you write about this in your book. It's about the way that you talk about it, because you also do not want to romanticize it. It's also a term that Mr. Macho mentions. It seems quite complicated. So my question to all three of you is, how do you handle this tension? What is the right balance? Maybe Derek, you can comment on this first.
Yeah, because I was indeed triggered by the more aesthetic aspect. You asked, is suicide, can it be aesthetic? I think that's something which we should try not to say, actually, because then it becomes an intellectual debate, same as Albert Camus also said in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus. That most people in a philosophical debate think about it, but they don't follow through on it because it's more an intellectual thing. And for patients who are really sick and psychiatric, it might not be helpful to really see it more as a romantic view. So I think if we talk about it, we should not romanticize it. We should be very careful not to call it aesthetic, which can be done in an intellectual fashion. But in psychiatry, it's actually, we try to be... also not to be really against it. So also not, as you also said, Thomas, that it can be something which can be a relief for people. So you want to be open about it. You want to say that you can discuss it, that you're open to, that you're not afraid to discuss it. But we should always try to see if that it's not normal behavior. We should not romanticize it or make it normal, or always try to say, well, that help is possible. If you talk about it, that really helps. So I think that's an important message to stress when you talk about it, and to also not be judgmental about it. And don't say you should not do it. Don't do it. And you should promise me not to do it because I will never get over it, or those kinds of moralizing things are things that we just advise not to do, but more to be open and say, oh, that's really terrible that you feel like that. Could you tell me more about that? Be more an open, neutral discussion about it. That's what we think is, at least from a prevention perspective, it's best to do.
Saskia?
Yeah, if I may add also, at 113 we say, sit on your hands, don't give too much advice, but listen, like Derek explained, is very important. But also at the other end, ask if people have concrete plans. So you have to be very careful if they have made a plan, or and another important thing is try people also, especially with young people, don't keep a secret for a friend of you, but it's very important that they talk about it with their parents or go to the GP. So that is also very important.
Okay. Mr. Macho, what is your response to this tension?
I'm agreeing totally, and that's the point. I'm not a fan of romanticization, of course, and on the other side, we have really a lot of actual representations of suicide in literature, in movies. I have the feeling it has really increased. I think around the last 20 novels I read during the lockdown, I found really a lot of suicide topics in it, even if I didn't expect it. When I bought, for example, Ian McEwan's Machines Like Me, I didn't know before that's novel about cyborgs and androids and such things, but it's on the other side, it's a novel about suicide.
Yeah.
And or reading one of the last novels of Judith Zehe, a German author, Leere Herzen, the German title. It's a novel about suicide. And I thought, okay, now I have to finish with. I read now a slight and simple criminal a novel, and then not such lit. And I think about one of the psycho novels by Sebastian Fritz, and it was again totally only about suicide. And this is interesting, and I don't know where it emerges and what's the point of it, and that's interesting, and it's even necessary to talk about these things. I wanted to have, I would prefer to read a study, but it's not possible to get it or to have it, about development in TV series like the German Tatort, or I don't know if Netherlands have similar series, and to see how they deal with this topic, suicide. I think it has increased, and there are a lot more scenes, and they are prepared careful. I think they even have read the advices of Thomas Niedergotenthaler, and but the topic is present, and it's something like it would be present in a not easy perceivable way. And therefore, this let's talk about this for me like an advice for myself, and even for all things you can do in suicide prevention.
I was just, for me personally, I have noticed that when in the Netherlands, when someone who's well-known, famous, commits suicide, that in nowadays sometimes the term is used, and I find it somewhat difficult to translate. In Dutch is hij heeft zelf besloten uit het leven te stappen. Yeah. So he has decided to leave life, to sort of literally step away from life. Would you say that is romanticizing it as a kind of self-determination or not? It's just.
Well, the language with this topic is always very difficult, and actually we don't. I think the English really object now. It's a new thing to commit suicide because it's always too much about murder, and zelfmoord. That's what you always have discussion with. Is also too much murder, which you discussed in your book as well. Uit het leven stappen, yeah. It sounds for me like a normal phrase, but there are always people who feel offended by it. So it's very difficult to do this. You can never do it right with this topic. I think it's really difficult.
Saskia, you were also saying yes.
I think for the bereaved ones, the next of kin, it's very difficult to hear. Oh, it was his choice, because we all say, people are so entrapped in the situation. They think suicide is the only solution to them for their painful situation. But it's not like a choice. So I think the word choice, I think this is more painful for people who lost someone. But uit het leven stappen, okay.
So we do find that selfmoord is like the name that people use in common language, and zelfdoding is now what we use in the media, and then suicide is what we more use as scientists. So that's it's going to be a difficult discussion. And,
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Macho, would you like to comment on this as well?
No, I agree totally. This is a problem with the terminology. I decided to speak about suicide whenever it's possible, and because I had in the ear what theology in the 17th century said. Suicide is much more worse than murder, because it's a double murder. The suicide kills not only his body, but even his immortal soul. And if he would be a simple murderer, he would kill the body of another person, but not the immortal soul of this body. And therefore, I hate this term self-moord. And like very much paradox sentences like this one I like very much, in which André Breton quoted when he asked on the survey of I think the second volume of La Révolution Surréaliste, where they had a survey discussion on the question, is suicide a solution? And Breton quoted this sentence. It says, self-killing yourself is a wrong word. Suicide is a wrong word, because the person who kills and the person who is killed is never the same. And this is an interesting optic. And Elias Canetti wrote 1951 in a crisis during his time in London. Every one of us has a twin who threatens with suicide. And this is a very interesting thing, where they are not the same.
Thank you. And now I would like to give the opportunity for people present here and also through Zoom to ask questions. Now we have very bright lights here. So I know Hans is in the room with a microphone for people here. And Lauren is sitting over there. And maybe we'll start with Lauren. Are there any questions for people listening with us online?
No, not yet. And if there's somebody here in the audience who has a question, it's up here. You can ask it and I will translate it and say it out loud to everybody.
Okay, so I can really not see the people in the room because of the bright lights.
Full, it's packed.
But Hans, maybe are there any questions now too?
I have one.
Yes?
So I'm wondering, you discussed that it's good that people can speak about suicide more. So are you then happy with something like 30 Reasons Why? Do you consider this a good thing because it opens it up more, or do you consider it a bad thing because it causes limitation effects?
So I will repeat the question that we discussed, that it is a good thing to speak about suicide, people or suicidal thoughts, for example. And your question is it then a good thing, like a series on Netflix on 13 Reasons Why? Is that a good thing to give an impulse to speaking about it, or is it maybe a negative thing because it may give contagion effects? Saskia, would you like to start?
Yeah, the good thing is obviously the discussion about it, but at 1.3 we disapprove this series because of the explicit method they show. So you could also portray someone who was feeling suicidal, but then we prefer the part, the Papageno effect, that you also show the recovery, the coping of someone. So also with the death of Avicii, we didn't like that the Telegraaf with the wine glass, and we don't want that the media explicitly tells the method. Yeah.
Okay.
That's what you also said as well. It depends on how you talk about it. So the thing they did really correctly in 13 Reasons Why is they broke all the rules that we have. So they were...
there are rules then for media?
Yeah, well, there are media guidelines which made. So don't make explicit the method. Don't show it very, because it gets in their mind and it visualizes them. It shows that helping doesn't help. Just looking for help doesn't help. That's because she goes to a counselor and that's the final straw, and then she decides to kill herself. Don't romanticize it, because suicide is being used as a way of punishing others. And they tick all the boxes of doing things wrong. So I think that series is not effective to discuss what you said as well, this discussion, because we should have it's a great medium for Netflix to do a series like that, but please be work a bit more with suicide prevention experts.
Yes, then it can actually help people.
Then it can open up the discussion, definitely,
okay.
yeah.
Okay. Mr. Macho, you mentioned a lot of books where even when you didn't expect it, suicide was a topic in it. Did you also see the series 13 Reasons Why?
I read the book. I didn't see the series. I read the book, 13 Reasons Why, and was very interested because it's a book even about history of media. And it's very interesting because she makes this with this old cassette, not disc, and not WhatsApp or Instagram or something else, but this old. I thought it's very interesting to see how she goes back in the medial technology. Is a girl from now, but uses this old technology, and maybe to survive as a voice or something like this. It's not possible if we write our messages on WhatsApp or Instagram or Facebook. It's not possible to be present as a voice. And maybe it's important for the idea of this fictional girl to survive as a voice, and therefore to use this older technology.
But do you think that the series, Derek and Saskia are quite critical because of the way and some aspects that were portrayed? And the question from the audience here was: Is it a positive thing, that series, to take the taboo away, to talk about it, or was it negative because it may have contagion effects?
First of all, it's positive to deal and talk with the topic, and of course there are a lot of things. Of course, I didn't see the series, but I believe it immediately. There are a lot of things wrong. Therefore, it's maybe a good collection of examples for teaching suicide prevention. They don't do it like they did. My argument is it's so important to have the chance of conversation and the chance not to be pathologized on the first side, even respected and recognized as a person with serious problems, but not with only with disease or with something disturbing quality we have to correct. When I was a boy, my father was engaged, befriended with Erwin Ringe in Vienna, and they founded one of very early suicide prevention centers. But do you know how they called it? I'm not even able to translate it now in English nor in Dutch. They called Lebensmüdenfürsorge.
Yes.
This is such a nice term. This is.
Can I just try to translate it?
Yeah, okay.
So it's about in Dutch. It's about zorg voor levensmoeie mensen, mensen die levensmoe zijn. And in English, that would be something like being tired of life, literally taken. Right?
And Fürsorge is such a wonderful term, and I thought it's something like respect and acknowledging there is, it could be we are in such a condition, and we are not not on the first side the ill and the people who have a strange malady or something like this.
Mm. Okay. Again, see across the bright lights. Are there any other questions? Yes.
It's not easy to talk about.
Okay, so if you're sort of on the other side of the table, so you do not have the suicidal thoughts, but you want to encourage people to talk about how do you do that? Okay, thank you. Derek, any ideas?
So what we in trainings then say that they're mostly clinicians is that, so if somebody tells a story and then you can easily reflect and saying, well, that sounds like a lot you need to take in. And I could imagine that you might have feelings that life is not worth living anymore. How is that for you? So that sort of gives sort of neutral opening. The important thing is to use open questions. Because we had this great study from Britain where they interviewed psychiatrists and they mainly asked closed questions with a negative answer they expected. You're not thinking about killing yourself, are you? Well, that's like the no-go, because nobody will ever then say, yes, I actually am. So you tend to sort of make it okay to discuss it, like, oh, this should be really terrible. And so yeah, do you ever think about killing yourself? Or you could make it even more easy, what I said before, then so other people that I know I have in comparable situations are having really difficulty with going on with life. How is this for you? Or to sort of to make it a bit easy for them to open up a bit about this. But that's really difficult. I mean, so it's easier to say this, but if you're in an actual situation where, and it's not a professional situation, it is a taboo topic. We're not topic we discuss every day. And you have a great
also the
online.
first, it's also the first part of the training, that people have to practice to ask this question, because it's the most difficult part. Yeah, and at 113 we have an online training. So in an hour you can also read some theory about it, but also practice. And also you see examples of asking people about their suicidal thoughts.
We find this even psychiatrists and psychologists and GPs, they find it difficult.
Yeah.
So imagine being a normal person. So it's such an unusual topic you don't discuss every day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's, by the way, maybe also good to mention, you just talked about the guidelines for media, but in the book, for example, so the translation of Mr. Macho, and I think it probably also in your book, but also in the book review in newspaper Trouw on Mr. Macho's book, there's always the line, you know, do you have these thoughts or you want to talk about it? You can call 113 suicide prevention. And Mr. Macho, I find it really touching because, well, you do not do trainings like Derek and Saskia, who works at the helpline, but really touching when you talked about, when I wrote this book, friends that I've known for many years came to me and shared these stories.
Yes, this was for me very, very touching and surprising. I didn't expect these situations.
Did you have other similar reactions from the media or from people emailing you or from clinicians?
Yes, sometimes. More students than people from media, a lot of course, but it was, and I had some very interesting encounters with people from suicide prevention in Switzerland, and even I had one presentation together with Michael Enck in Hanover, who is the director of a Center for Suicide Prevention, and we had a very interesting discussion on this think with don't pathologize it immediately. And he said, and this is important for us too, he said, and I didn't expect this statement too, as he said, it's important even for our people in the clinic. If they think they have decided wrong to give somebody the chance to go home, or then they have feelings of guilt for a long time.
Yeah.
And it's possible to have another way to come around with these situations. If you can say, it's now my position, if this happens, to respect it and not to seek the guilty one.
Yeah.
Thank you. Lauren, are there any other questions? Or Hans?
It's from Lillian, and she says, I often encountered the opinion that those who talk about their wish to end their lives are asking for attention, and those who really want it just do it. How do you see this?
I think maybe it's good to, everyone heard this, right? Because you have the microphones, or do I have to repeat the question? No? Okay. Because Derek, you say something about this in your book, in the sense where you make a distinction between men and women, right?
Yes, yeah.
Can you explain that?
Well, so if I write a new edition of this book, this is a myth I would definitely try to tackle, because people ask that a lot, that question. And I do discuss that you can talk about it. And there's a gender bias that males tend to talk less about it, but die more often by suicide. And women tend to talk more about suicidal thoughts and less often die. But it's absolutely not true that people communicate about feeling entrapped. They also can communicate about their suicidality. So if they talk about it, it's definitely something to take serious. So it's definitely not something to think, oh, it's only attention, and it opens a real great possibility for prevention. So you should always, the difficult thing is with people with chronic suicidality, those are people who are suicidal for years and years. And then you keep on discussing it, but then it's difficult to see when, it's like Mr. Macho said, that some people see it as a comfort, and then it's difficult to distinguish an acute crisis from the comfort. So then they see suicidal behavior as something which is comforting for them, but sometimes it can be still too much, and they still can die by suicide. So it's definitely not true that if they talk about it, they will not do it. It is true that some people just don't give any signals out there. And those are mainly the male participants that we find. And we know that like half of the patients in the month before they die by suicide visit the GP, the general practitioner, but they don't then discuss the suicidal thoughts. So they come for other things. And it's really difficult, even for a trained GP, to recognize suicidal behavior, because most people don't talk about it. Or not most people, but there are also a lot of people who don't talk about it.
So it's actually, you should not see it as just seeking attention, because it's very important. There's a chance for prevention. I saw you also nodding, Saskia.
Yeah, we also found in our research about youth suicide that half of the study group had already attempted suicide. So you should also take it seriously. Yeah, it's not only a cry for help or for attention, because they also what we call in theory acquired capability for committing suicide. It's like practicing to die. If you cut yourself, or then when you do it continuously, then also in our study we saw that we examined the lives of 35 adolescents who died by suicide, and 6 of them were admitted to a hospital, and then even then they were capable of killing themselves also, after several suicide attempts. So you have to be very careful.
Right. But maybe now, as you mentioned, talking about it even for trained professionals is very hard. But let's say that someone, you know, close to you, and you're not a trained professional, you're not a healthcare worker, you're not a GP or a psychiatrist or a psychologist or anything, but a friend maybe or a relative is talking about it. What can you do then? Or because we already discussed, it's important how you talk about it, but what sort of like first advice would you give that people can do then?
Yeah, I think social support is very important. So it's very important, yeah, to take your time and to express your sympathy. And at the other hand, professional help is also very important.
Okay.
So
talk with that person.
yeah,
Shall we
try
seek
to refer them
professional help?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can then join them, so you can offer them to go to the GP with them. So that's something we how you can help that person, because it's good to realize that people most people are ashamed of their suicidal thoughts. So if they open up to somebody, that's really something. And the initial thing would be what you said as well: sit on your hands and just let the people discuss, and don't try to solve anything, and don't try to say you can solve things or you can repair the relationship with their mother or anything to make you, because you really feel uncomfortable, you want to help somebody. But the thing is, just listen, sit on your hands, and then see if you can find professional help with that. And you can refer to 113 as well for that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? I think I see a hand behind the bright lights. U kunt het ook in het Nederlands doen en dan proberen wij te vertalen.
Proberen wij in het Nederlands.
Ja.
Praten, ik dacht dat Macho dat ook zei, dat we in onze cultuur wel steeds meer erover praten. Ja. Dat het steeds meer een normaal of niet of meer normaal onderwerp wordt, waar we tegelijkertijd totaal geen raad mee weten. Bijvoorbeeld agenten en docenten en weet ik wat. Maar als je kijkt naar middelbare scholen, daar heb je 3 op 100.000 jongeren overlijden. Dat betekent dat je 30 scholen met 1000 leerlingen moet trainen om 1 suïcide te krijgen. En is dan nog gemiddeld niet veel erger dan de 12.
Okay, thank you. So I will try to translate, and if I forget something, maybe you can give me a hand. So the question was, isn't it actually maybe a myth that talking more about suicide is always a good thing? And you also addressed that, for example, when we know that, what did you say, 3 in 100,000 youngsters commit suicide? So you would have to train like 30,000 people before you would maybe reach that person. So maybe first, because you also referred to Mr. Macho saying that we talk about it more and more, apparently it's more and more an item in this modern age. Mr. Macho, would you like to respond first to this?
I can try. I don't think talking about it should be something like an order, and we have to train and discuss 30,000 people. That's not the point. And it's often I had the experience, it's often in situations you won't expect. You come in contact with such stories or something, and maybe I can tell you what I had, and it was a discussion with a good friend who is a psychoanalyst, and he had the idea to ask all his friends how many suicides they had by friends or related persons, and they had in their lives seen and to produce a list. And I did myself. On the first moment, I thought, oh no, I don't remember any suicide in the circle of my friends. And at the end, I was, I think, at the number of 12. And my friend told me 1 week later, I asked the same question another friend, and he said to me, no, there is nobody. I had never contact with any situations where a friend or a better known person committed suicide. And next day I met him again, and instead of greeting me, he said, 15. And it was, and we have our secret lists. And even people dealing a lot with these topics are maybe not able to produce this list if they are asked for it. How many people in your life did you know? How often did it occur? And I think this, let's talk about it, should not be something like a command, and now we must, it wouldn't work. Maybe it's possible more to have it in the style of a game, of a friendly game.
Okay, okay. So Derek, gentleman in the audience asked, isn't it actually a myth? Would it be a myth that you would add
Well, I think it's a
next edition of your book?
It's a very good point, and also very complicated for a prevention perspective. And I also don't think the whole focus on suicide prevention, I think it's a bit too narrow. I would rather see a very broad, on high schools, do a broad mental health training, and then take suicide as a topic in that. So the mantra of everybody should be able to talk about it. I also don't believe that's really effective, also giving the low numbers, also giving the stigma. I also do not believe so much in screening, because then you need to screen a lot of people, and there's a lot of stigma with that, and you miss also a lot of people, or you have too many positive people. So
you mean screening for suicide?
For suicide, yeah, for suicide. There's some ideas that you should, for example, screen on high schools for that. And I would rather see that we're more able to discuss emotional problems as a broader theme, and then suicide is a more natural thing within that. But I think 113 disagrees with me on that.
Yes.
Saskia,
Now, I think
enlighten
we
us.
can extend the program with depression. So you were talking about the prevalence rates, 3 per 100,000, but depression is more common among adolescents. So we are now preparing a national implementation of a program which screens students of secondary schools in 2nd grade and 4th grade on depressive symptoms and also on suicidality. And for about 10% of the children also suffer from depressive complaints, and then they are able to get treatment via school. So in my opinion, we also have in Netherlands at primary school programs against bullying.
Yeah.
And then you saw that the prevalence rates of bullying are decreasing. And I can also see in the class of my children, there's a lot of room for discussing about social emotional development. So I would like to continue this program line to secondary schools. And yeah, I agree with Derek, more talk about emotional problem, but also keep an eye on the mental health of secondary school children.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question from the audience, if there is one. Yeah?
Dat mag niet.
Er is genoeg ruimte hier.
Ja.
1,5 meter. Okay, so the question is, a death wish, is it like only acceptable for people who are having really big problems? Or can it also be the case with people who maybe have not money problems, no relation problems, but still have a death wish? And how could you prevent that?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, could you repeat the last part? Okay. So to follow up on the question, or is there no such group of people who maybe do not have problems, but still a death wish? Or is it always that when you have a death wish that you have mental problems, etc.? I think it's a very interesting question. I'm also thinking, Derek, I would like to start with you again, because one of the myths that you address is that people who are suicidal always have a death wish.
Yeah, so that's actually
Yeah.
the counter thing about that. So the myth that I discuss is that actually most people who are suicidal, they don't per se want to die, but they would rather not go on living. So they want to escape from their situation or their thoughts, but they do not per se want to die. They actually do not want to live the life that they're living anymore. And that's the big group, and you see that, because I do think that there's a small group which you describe that actually exists, that some people, even if life is okay, they still have this, but most likely there's still some trauma or some underlying because it's so counterintuitive to how we're programmed. We were so programmed to go on with life that the chances of finding somebody who has no problems at all and still have the death with, I do think that they will exist. I mean, it's a minority group. So I think most people who are chronically suicidal have this traumatic history or a bad attachment from childhood or other factors. And I also think that most people, as I said, do actually not want to die, but rather don't want the life that they're living in at this moment. But I think the main bottom line is it's suicidal behavior is really complex and individual. So I think every exception is actually possible. And that makes prevention also really difficult. So we always look at statistics and group statistics, but it's such highly personal death wish and suicidal behavior that I will never say that there's no such a case on these things. Yeah.
It somewhat reminds me of the discussion on completed life.
Yeah.
So, or you know, I'm just done living for elderly people. Usually it's for elderly people. Maybe Saskia, do you encounter the youngsters who say, well, I don't really have problems, but I just don't want to go on living?
Actually, it's quite common that young people think about the death, but it could be temporarily. It's just a phase in their life. So one out of 5 youngsters sometimes thinks about the death or to end their life, but it's just a part of growing up. And at 113, we also an important risk group that also Derek describes in his book are the middle-aged men who lost their job or their relationship, are unemployed, and also arbeidsongeschikt. So
not able to work anymore because of limitations.
They don't necessarily suffer from depression, but their social problems are most important.
Okay. Mr. Macho, the question from the audience actually reminded me of, you also referred to, I think it was Albert Camus, who connected the question of suicide on the question, is life worth living?
Yes. This was in the beginning of Mythos Sisyphus, this passage by Camus, and now we are reading La Peste and not the Myth of Sisyphus. And it's now really a bestseller. I saw in a lot of bookstores. Such a big. Okay, that's another point.
Another lecture.
I think one of the problems with death wish and death drive is what can we imagine with what we wish and what we drive, and if death is not imaginable. And yesterday I had the chance to see a German documentary from 2012 with the title Seven, or Why I Am in the World. And it were interviews with, I think, 7 or 8 children from different cultures on the questions, why are you in the world? And they are great, even 7-year-old girls or boys are great philosophers, but they are thinking about this unthinkable world from where they came if they were born. And they are, like Freud says, I think in his sexual theory, that's the first research project which children have to solve or to go for. And the question, where are we coming from? And it was interesting. It was very near to the question of death and totally different on the other side. And a rather beautiful answer gave a little boy from Paris. He said in French, I can't quote exactly, he said, I was born because my mom and my dad found le bonheur, the luck or happiness. And I thought, what a wonderful point to have his own origin in le bonheur of mom and dad. And this is, and 7-year-old boy speculating about nothing and nothingness and world before his birth and such things, and giving this answer is a rather beautiful point in this movie. Please apologize for this longer exposition.
No, thank you. I actually, I think it would be a beautiful conclusion of the evening. I do, although I would like to ask you the last question as our main guest for the evening, and that is, like I said at the start, your book. Which in German, I do not have it here in front of me, was Sich das Leben nehmen.
Das Leben nehmen. Only
Das Leben nehmen? Okay, yeah, das Leben nehmen. Suizid in der Moderne, nicht? Yeah,
correct.
But in Dutch, it has been translated into Van wie is je leven, which I would translate back to English in like, to whom does your life belong?
Yes.
Because the book is about suicide through the ages or in modernity, but it's also connected to that a lot about life, about our life. So maybe a very personal question, Mr. Macho, but as the last question, how would you answer this question? To whom does your life belong?
A very good question for the end, but a very
Thank
complicated question.
you.
I'm not quite sure if my life belongs to anybody. Nor my. Maybe the best answer would be for me now. It's not a universal answer. Maybe some part of my life belongs to my children.
Yeah.
And yes. And
your wife, maybe?
I have 2 maybe, but my children, I think it's if I had a part to bring them to world. Now remembering the children from the yesterday documentary, and then I have something I should try to be there for them as long as I'm able to. And it's a very hard experience if you lose father or mother through suicide, because they say implicitly, it's not worth what I gave you. And therefore, partly belongs to my children, but I fear not to myself.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and being so open, talking to us about your book and about this very complicated, very important topic, and for your personal note at the end. Thank you so much. Vielen Dank.
Vielen
And
Dank.
now I continue in German. Now I won't do that.
In the end.
That's not a good idea. Now I would also like to thank the other guests for this evening, Saskia Mérelle and Derek de Beurs. Thank you so much for your contributions. And I would also like to thank the people who are not inside, you do not see on the screen, but Lauren, who was screening the questions from people online, and Hans, who was in the audience with to screen the questions, and also the people taking care of all the technical organization, so that we had this opportunity to have the conversation. Jochem and Peter, thank you so much. And of course, thank you to people here who joined us this evening, and the people at home or wherever you are who joined us online. And we hope to see you soon again on one of the other programs that Arminius organizes. And until then, and also after that, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and talk to each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. So, hope to see you sometime in a reality and to have opportunity to talk. And I'll read your book. Ciao.
Round and around and up and down we go. Round and around and up and down we go. Round and around and up and down we go. When we gonna stop, baby? Nobody knows. Ah, suck it to me. Give it to me. Give it to me. Suck it to me. Suck it to me. Suck it to me. Suck it to me. Ah, suck it to me. Suck it to me. I'm in love with Mary Jane. I'm in love with Mary Jane.
Mary Jane got me right on top. Got them highs, never wanted to stop.
She's my main thing. She's my main thing.
Mary Jane make me feel so good.
She makes me feel alright. She makes me feel alright.
Mary Jane.
She's my main thing. She's my main thing.
Mary Jane make me feel so good.
I'm in love with Mary Jane. 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 I'm in love with Mary Jane.
Mary Jane.